The day this video goes live, The Legend of Heroes Kuro no Kiseki, the 11th game in the fantastic cult classic JRPG franchise known in the West as Trails, will be releasing in Japan. A few months ago, series developer Nihon Falcom and Western publisher NIS America announced that 4 games in the series will be officially localized for the first time and be available on all major platforms by the end of 2023. For someone who's caught up on the series like me, this is objectively terrible news because they delayed the localization of the next part of the actual story, but for someone thinking of starting their Trails journey right now, this is objectively fantastic. The series is one gigantic continuity spanning all 11 games now, and prior to this announcement, there were several gaps in the story in terms of localization. So, while you might not be getting Kuro anytime close to release, by the end of the year after next, you will be able to play all of the series up until then in the proper order with an official release for the very first time. There are guides about getting into Trails elsewhere on YouTube, but those were all made well before these announcements, so this is a more updated version with the knowledge of these 4 games coming out in English officially in the future. I'll explain the series a bit just so you can gauge interest, and then give a recommended way to start playing through it, assuming you're planning on starting anytime between now in late 2021 and when the last of those 4 localizations comes out in what's probably going to be late 2023. I know my audience is primarily big Xeno fans, so let me say up front, if you're a Xeno fan who's finished Gears and Saga and wants some filler series to play through while you're waiting for Xenoblade 3 or whatever's coming next, play Trails. A lot of the games will be made available on Switch, and a lot of the rest you can play on a potato PC. Tetsuya Takahashi worked at Falcom before he even worked at Square, and the Trails games have a lot of similarities to the Xeno series in certain ways, including the localization of one of them directly quoting Xenogears. This shouldn't even be a question for the hardcore Xeno fans. Just wait for the next Steam sale, pick up Sky First Chapter for $10 US, and get started from there. You do not need to sit through the next hour and 15 minutes, but you might want to go through the chapters in the description and find the recommended play order to at least know where to go from there. For those of you who are not Xeno fans of the Gears, Saga, or Blade variety, what is Nihon Falcom, and what is the Trails series anyway? Before I continue, I should just remind you to take a look at the video length. Trails is the one piece of JRPGs, both in world building and in length, so it's going to take a massive video to properly explain and do justice. There are chapters, you can see exactly what you want to know about, and you can skip straight to the play order if I've convinced you at any point during the video. Feel free to watch this in multiple sittings, or to not watch the entire thing. This is a great series, and I think it needs the rigor I'm giving it, but you yourself might not need to watch all of it to understand if you want to play it or not. Falcom is one of the oldest Japanese game developers out there. These localizations were announced at a 40th anniversary celebration concert. This company is as old as Donkey Kong the arcade game, so they've been around the block quite a few times. In the present day, they're probably most known for the Trails series and being on PlayStation consoles, but in the past, they'd be most known for their killer action RPGs with equally killer soundtracks for PC. If you're gonna credit Enix and Square with inventing the JRPG genre with Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, you also have to credit Falcom with inventing the Japanese action RPG with games like Dragon Slayer and Ys. In fact, Dragon Slayer 1 is actually 2 years older than Dragon Quest 1, so in a way, the supposedly outdated turn-based RPG is actually younger than real-time RPGs. In the present day, much to the chagrin of older fans, Falcom focuses almost exclusively on Ys and Trails, its 2 main moneymaker franchises, with the former being action RPGs and the latter turn-based. While Ys is extremely episodic by nature and rarely has overarching continuity actually play into events if it does at all in a certain game, Trails has been telling one complete story for over 15 years now, and will take a lot of commitment if you want to see the full picture. But as for the history of Trails, this long-running turn-based JRPG franchise is actually a spin-off of the action pioneer Dragon Slayer. After making several Dragon Slayer sequels, updates, and re-releases from 1984 through 1989, as well as 3 action-based Ys games, Falcom released Dragon Slayer The Legend of Heroes for several Japanese PC models in 1989. This was a turn-based RPG, technically in the Dragon Slayer franchise, which was followed up by a direct sequel, Dragon Slayer: The Legend of Heroes 2 in 1992. After that, the next 3 Legend of Heroes games took place in a shared world, but separate from the first 2, with Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch in 1994, A Tear of Vermilion in 1996, and Song of the Ocean in 1999. These 3 games, known as the Gagarv Trilogy, were the first Legend of Heroes games to release on Windows, coming out between April of 1999 and December of 2000. This started a tradition that carries on to this very day, as every single Trails game is going to be available on Windows in some capacity, with all of them being on Steam, by the end of 2023. After the conclusion of the Gagarv Trilogy, the series went on a bit of a hiatus, only to return with a vengeance in 2004, with the release of The Legend of Heroes 6, Sora no Kiseki, known in English as Trails in the Sky. This is the first game in the actual Trails series this video is about, so while there are plenty of fans of the first 5 Legend of Heroes, and I believe they're all playable through various means today, I won't be focusing on them and will only talk about games that were released under the Trails banner, because believe me, there are already plenty of those to go around. It is worth noting that Sky is not the only Trails game to have a number in the larger Legend of Heroes series, but it gets really confusing because Trails resets its numbering every arc, and each multi-game long Trails arc counts for 1 number in the Legend of Heroes series, so basically, the 3 Sky games are collectively Legend of Heroes 6, Zero and Azure are collectively Legend of Heroes 7, Cold Steel 1 through Cold Steel 4, and I'm assuming also Reverie, are all Legend of Heroes 8, and Kuro no Kiseki is the first part of the Legend of Heroes 9. Do not worry if you didn't understand any of that, I will get to it. Back to 2004, due to various development issues, the original planned version of The Legend of Heroes 6 was not able to be completed by the initial projected release date, so Falcom did what they did back with Ys 1, and chopped the game in half. The 2004 game then received the moniker Trails in the Sky First Chapter, and contained the first half of the story, and its follow-up, Trails in the Sky Second Chapter, Finishing the Plot, released in 2006. In 2007, a sort of bridge game came out called Trails in the Sky the Third. It serves as an epilogue to the story of First and Second Chapter, while also setting up plenty of interesting plot threads for the future of the Trails series, as Falcom decided they really wanted to expand on the world they already had going. I'm just going to speedrun the rest of this release timeline here, because I also have to talk about the worldwide releases, which, due to the massive amount of text in the series, went through their own development hell independent of the games themselves, and as such, the localizations came out in a wildly different order than the Japanese releases of the actual series, which is the recommended play order, so that's why this video exists really. All 3 Sky games initially released for PC, but quickly got ports to the PSP, and much later got updated re-releases for PS Vita and PS3. In 2010, the series entered its second proper arc with the release of Zero no Kiseki, known in English as Trails from Zero, which first released for PSP, but then was later ported to PC and Vita, with an updated re-release much later on for PS4 and Switch, with this re-release being what the localized version is going to be based off of. It was followed up the next year by its direct sequel, Ao no Kiseki, known in English as Trails to Azure, which also released first on PSP before getting ported to Windows and Vita, although Japan didn't get the Windows port this time, only China did for some reason, and then later getting a PS4 Switch updated re-release, which is again what the localization will be based on. The series entered its third arc in 2013 with the release of Sen no Kiseki, known in English as Trails of Cold Steel, for PS3 and PS Vita. While it was definitely evident in Zero and Azure and Falcom's other series, this is where their decision to switch from primarily PC development to primarily PlayStation development really hit, and from this point on, every PC version of a Trails game is either going to be done by a third-party Japanese studio, or be part of an official or fan localization. Trails of Cold Steel 2 released for the same 2 platforms in 2014, and both games were ported to PS4 in 2018. Cold Steel very quickly became the longest arc in Trails history, with Cold Steel 3 releasing for PS4 exclusively in 2017, and Cold Steel 4 for PS4 in 2018. Sen no Kiseki 4 is subtitled End of Saga, while Trails of Cold Steel 4 is not, so if you see that phrase thrown around, that's what it's attributed to. As of Cold Steel 4, the overarching plot of Trails has reached roughly the halfway point, so they decided to pull another Trails in the Sky the Third and make a bridge game into the second half of the series. This game was The Legend of Heroes Hajimari no Kiseki, now officially known in English as Trails into Reverie, which released in 2020 for PS4. And lastly, as I mentioned before, this very day, the series will formally enter its second half with the Japanese release of Kuro no Kiseki, which I'm personally going to be fan translating as Trails Before Daybreak until we get an official name, exclusively for PS4. As of now, Kuro is the only game we have no idea about a localization for. The entire 10-game first half of the story, from Trails in the Sky first chapter through Trails into Reverie, will be available worldwide by the end of 2023. As for the official localization timeline, here's where things get really messy. Sky First Chapter's PSP version did get an English release in 2011, but that uses a worse translation than the 2014 PC version, which I would not recommend playing. Sky Second Chapter's localization went through some really tragic, really tumultuous development hell, finally releasing for PC, and still PSP, believe it or not, in 2015. I honestly have no idea why they still released it for PSP. That's about as terrible a sales idea as releasing the PS4 exclusive Kuro no Kiseki in what's probably going to end up being 2025, when the PS6 is going to be on the horizon, but I digress. The localizations then skipped 3 entire games, with Trails of Cold Steel 1 being the next to release, coming out in North America and Europe between the end of 2015 and beginning of 2016. It then got an international PC port in 2017, and a translated version of the Japanese PS4 port was released in North America and Europe in 2019. A similar thing happened with Cold Steel 2, with the PS3 and Vita versions releasing in North America and Europe in 2016, a PC version coming in 2018, and PS4 in 2019. They were then finally able to get a localization of Trails in the Sky the Third done, releasing in 2017 for PC exclusively. For reference, it came out after the PS3 Vita versions of Cold Steel 1 and 2, but before the PC versions. And then the entire future of the series was thrown completely up in the air because Falcom ended their partnership with Xseed, the company which had been localizing and publishing Falcom games in the West, and there's a bit where the entire future of the series was in question until Falcom's new publishing partner, NIS America, announced a localization of Cold Steel 3. This came out worldwide for PS4 in 2019, later getting ported to PC and Switch in 2020, and Stadia in 2021 for some reason. Cold Steel 4 released for PS4 in 2020, and PC, Switch, and Stadia in 2021. And then things get weird, because we can finally go back to Trails from Zero. This is going to be releasing simultaneously worldwide on PC, PS4, and Switch in 2022, with the same thing happening for Azure and Reverie in 2023. We technically weren't given an order for when those two 2023 games are coming out, but based on logic and the order they were revealed, it's presumably going to be Azure, then Reverie. And also, just in case it needed to be said, yes, all these games are going to be for PS4, but they are all playable on PS5 due to backwards compatibility, including the Japanese version of Kuro. So with all that real-world history out of the way, let's talk some fictional history, because I gotta shill these games for you for a bit. If you've heard people praise one aspect of Trails before, it's probably been the world building, because that is where the series shines the most. Don't get me wrong, the other aspects of the series are great, and for the most part they rarely get worse than good but a bit generic, but world building is the one aspect in which Trails is consistently better than basically every other JRPG series on the market. The games take place in the Eurasian-inspired fictional continent of Zemuria, which has just entered the dawn of its 13th century. At the beginning of the series, the world is about 50 years removed from the Orbal Revolution, aka the rediscovery of ancient magitech, which was roughly analogous to the Industrial Revolution in the real world. This caused technology in Zemuria to rocket from probably about the real world 1150s to approaching modern day in a rapid period of time. This causes some really interesting technological dichotomies that would be weird anachronisms in the real world. When the series starts in the year 1202, you're already going to see things like electric lights, landline phones, cars, and tanks, and only a couple years later you're going to have characters walking around a city inspired by 50s and 60s New York with their cell phones and rudimentary internet access. Now, if you've been paying any attention to the screen, you might have noticed that most of half of the map is blank. This is for very good reason. The first half of the Trails series only focuses on Western Zemuria, with small lip service paid to what's going on east of Calvard. The series is split into multiple story arcs, each arc consisting of multiple games that are roughly self-contained but still contribute to a wider plot. At the beginning of each arc, you'll pick up with a new cast in a new location, often with a significant time skip from the end of the previous arc, and set about solving local problems that are informed not only by the location, but also the people and politics, both domestic and foreign, that are going on at the time. As an arc progresses, all the little pieces you might have been picking up will begin to come together and the scope will expand. The stakes will rise, the characters will develop, relationships will be formed, conspiracies will be unraveled, allies will become enemies, enemies will become allies, characters from previous arcs will swoop in to make the save at a decisive moment, and the entire fate of nations will rest on the outcome of your battles, all the while an even greater threat to all Zemuria lurks in the shadows. Suffice to say, there's a lot going on, and it takes a lot of text to get through. I would definitely go as far as to say the series contains visual novel elements with the length and depth of certain cutscenes, and the amount of pure detail there exists in the franchise. This is the series where, among all other JRPGs, you're going to want to go and talk to every NPC after every story beat. These guys have their own stories and go around their own daily lives doing various things, and may give some insight, foreshadowing, or just neat world-building perks that you won't get if you just mainline the story. There's plenty of side content, and you are ranked on how much you complete, along with doing certain things correct in the main story, so you might want to do that, both for the cool items you get, and for the additional world building and character development. The first arc of the series is comprised of the 3 Trails in the Sky games, and is known by fans as the Liberl Arc, as it primarily focuses around Liberl Kingdom, a small peaceful realm in the southwest corner of Zemuria. The arc follows the teenage Estelle Bright and her adopted brother Joshua as they seek to become members of the Bracer Guild, a non-governmental peacekeeping organization that operates throughout the entirety of Zemuria and does jobs ranging from rescuing cats from trees and helping with homework, to stopping demon summoning murder cults. Very soon after becoming junior bracers, Estelle's father Cassius, one of the highest ranked bracers in the world, goes missing, and it's up to the pair along with the cast of friends they meet along the way to try and find him. Estelle's journey will take her around the entirety of Liberl as she attempts to become a fully fledged bracer, find Cassius, and resolves any other plot threads she may come across along the way, and whatever developments the main plot may throw at her. This story starts in Trails in the Sky first chapter and ends officially at the end of second chapter. Sky the Third is a bit of a different beast. Despite bearing the Trails in the Sky name, Estelle is not the lead here. The protagonist role instead goes to second chapter supporting character Kevin Graham, aka the Trails protagonist Falcom wants you to forget. This is the first game to really delve into the religious aspect of Zemuria, as Kevin is a priest in the Septian Church, the lead religious authority in the land. Despite being the finale to the Liberl Arc, the game barely takes place in the kingdom itself. While Liberl, as well as the church's seat, the holy city of Arteria, are touched on a little bit, the vast majority of the game takes place in a mysterious dimension known as Phantasma, which Kevin, Estelle, and a bunch of other Sky characters find themselves trapped in. Most of the main plot of the third revolves around Kevin confronting his fears and his past as he tries to find a way back to the real world. Note, however, that I said main plot. Sky the Third is structured vastly differently from most Trails games. The majority of games in the series are fairly straightforward adventure-based JRPGs that see you exploring a country while you do a bunch of different things. The second game of an arc always involves retracing your steps and revisiting most areas from the first game while adding a few new ones, but third is a bit different. While you do revisit some areas from the first 2 Sky games, this game is primarily a dungeon crawler. This is perhaps the most combat-heavy game in the series, and definitely the one with the least NPCs to talk to. There is still side content though, and that's locked entirely behind the door system, which is arguably even more important than the main story itself. Depending on the door you walk into, you'll experience either a short scene, a long scene, or a minigame, sometimes involving combat, and these are where it gets really interesting. A lot of these are fluff, a lot of these are important but not vital world building, and a lot of them are further epilogues to second chapter story, but some of them are heavy foreshadowing for events that will take place throughout the rest of the series. Most things that were set up in Sky the Third were only fully paid off in Cold Steel 4, the end of the first half of Trails. Do not skip this game, even if you think the next ones are going to be more interesting. As far as timeline placement goes, Sky first chapter begins in Septian calendar year 1202, second chapter picks up right where it leaves off at the end of 1202 and goes through the beginning of 1203, and Sky the Third picks up 6 months after the end of second chapter and encompasses the end of 1203. The second arc is the Crossbell Arc, consisting of Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure. These games take place in Crossbell State, a small city-state that's home to Crossbell City, a technologically advanced metropolis, and is sandwiched between the 2 major superpowers of Zemuria, both of which want to claim it for their own. It's said that Crossbell was inspired by both New York City and Hong Kong, and if you play the games, you can definitely see where both of those are coming from. Our protagonist this time is Lloyd Bannings, a young detective who's returning to his hometown of Crossbell after leaving for a couple years due to the death of his legendary detective brother. Upon joining the Crossbell police force, he's immediately assigned to the Special Support Section, a brand new division that's full of misfits and seems to exist just for the sake of improving the police's reputation with the populace after the much less corrupt Bracer Guild started stealing their spotlight. Despite basically no one expecting anything out of the SSS, and the fact that their work is more discount bracer jobs than anything resembling what regular police officers would do, all the members do genuinely want to help people, and they quickly become minor local heroes. Throughout the story, the past, present, and future of both the characters and Crossbell are explored, as you delve deep into the corruption at the heart of the city, and fight for Crossbell's independence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. You start fighting the Mafia at like 10 hours into Zero, it's great. This arc definitely has a much more intimate feel than the previous one. While Liberl isn't giant as JRPG overworlds go, Crossbell is even smaller, and you have much more free reign of it, so you definitely feel like you get to know the city and its people really, really well. Additionally, the main cast, especially at the start, is a lot smaller than Sky's. You play through most of Zero just with the 4 founding members of the SSS, while Sky First Chapter had you rotate through 8 party members with only Joshua and Estelle remaining constant. Couple that with a bit smaller stakes and smaller in scope plot to begin with, and a world with only 4 major settlements you can visit, and you can get invested in a lot larger percentage of the cast than you could with the previous games. I haven't talked about the battle system yet, saving that for later, but despite reusing the same engine the Sky Trilogy did, Crossbell does make some significant changes to the battle system, with Azure specifically taking several steps forward that are maintained throughout Cold Steel. I'll fully explain my recommended play orders and reasoning behind them near the end of this video, but I'm also going to say now that despite Crossbell being the shortest arc in the series, my personal favorite, and Azure being my favorite Trails game as a whole, I would not recommend starting the series here playing Crossbell as a self-contained thing. Not only are plot threads introduced in 2nd chapter and the 3rd picked up on as soon as you get out of the tutorial of Zero, but once the SSS gets to know some returning Sky characters well enough, they'll spell out pretty much everything that happens near the climax of the Liberl arc. Additionally, the first 2 Cold Steel games, a much better starting place in my opinion, take place concurrently with the Crossbell arc, mostly Azure, and as such, you'll learn about things happening elsewhere in Zemuria that are straight up major spoilers for CS 1 and 2 that came out years before those games ever released. Now, that's not to say that characters in Cold Steel don't have access to news from Crossbell that spoils things from Zero and Azure as well. I just think CS 1 and 2 are a better starting point for a Trails newcomer than the Crossbell arc, and that the spoilers for that arc it gives are a bit less egregious than the ones Crossbell gives for Cold Steel. Also, the official localizations of Zero and Azure are going to be based on the Japanese PS4 re-releases, which came out after Cold Steel 4 did in Japan, so Falcom took the opportunity to add cameos from Cold Steel characters who didn't exist at the time of Zero and Azure's initial release, but were later mentioned to have been in Crossbell during the events of those games, as well as setting up characters who will be relevant when the series returns to Crossbell later down the road. As for the timeline, Zero picks up only a few weeks after the end of Sky the Third, which is why it directly continues some plot threads, in January of Septian calendar year 1204, and ends in May. There's a 2-month time skip before Azure begins in August and ends in December, the day before New Year's Eve. The 3rd arc, the last one in the first half of the series, and the final one to have been completed as of now, is the Erebonia arc, which consists of the 4 Trails of Cold Steel games. Some people might also consider Trails into Reverie to be a 5th game in this arc, but I personally count it separately as its own thing after Erebonia but before the start of the 2nd half of the series, because it does not bear the Cold Steel name, and while it does continue things mentioned in Cold Steel 4, it's more of a Sky the Third-esque epilogue to both the Erebonia and Crossbell arcs, as opposed to just being an Erebonia-based thing like Sky the Third was for Liberl. The setting of this arc is the gigantic Erebonian Empire, the strongest nation in Western Zemuria, and one of the 2 superpowers that's been trying to annex Crossbell. It also attempted to invade Liberl about 10 years prior to the start of the Sky games, creating a conflict that resulted in the death of Estelle Bright's mother, and was only ended by then military officer Cassius Bright's powerful counteroffensive. Suffice to say, the Empire as a whole hasn't been shown in the greatest of light so far in the series, and this arc explores some of the reasoning behind that, focusing a lot on the ongoing class conflict between nobles and commoners, which has been exacerbated by the massive technological advancements, and the country's relatively new, ruthless expansionism, which was spurred on by the appointment of the first common-born chancellor in Erebonian history, Anime Otto von Bismarck, the Blood and Iron Chancellor Gileath Osborne, who has appeared in the past in Sky III and Azure. These conflicts are made a bit more complicated by the fact that Osborne, being a commoner, does want to reform the class structure, but none of the good guys in this arc really want to see Erebonia conquer more territory, which it's only going to do under Osborne's control, and the Emperor doesn't seem like he's going to rein him in at all. If you've been looking at this map, you might have noticed that Erebonia is kind of massive compared to the previous two settings. While Falcom does tend to play pretty fast and loose with precise geography and the size of things, like Crossbell used to be most of the size of Liberl before they changed it, Erebonia is way larger than the other two combined. As such, you do not get to explore the entire country in one game, and there are several areas you don't really see a lot of, even throughout the entire Cold Steel series. For the most part, Cold Steel is effectively split up into two mini-arcs with a time skip in between. Cold Steel 1 and 2 mainly focuses on the eastern third of the country, going as far west as the capital Heimdall and as far south as Legram, as well as the Nord Highlands, an independent territory that's usually allied with the Empire and is mainly populated by pastoral nomads. Cold Steel 3 and 4 primarily focus on the western area of the Empire, which was completely unvisited in 1 and 2, going as far south as St. Arc and as far west as Ortis, though you never go to the extreme northwest and northeast of the country. You do also visit a specific important location from a previous arc, though I'm not really going to talk about that here. Despite the games making the transition to full 3D, areas are still cordoned off in very similar ways to how they were in the previous game, with you getting 2 or 3 separate instances making up a highway in between two towns, and each town consisting of maybe 1 to 3 different screens. As such, you both do and don't get a sense of the true scale of the Empire. Taking the highway in between cities might seem smaller than you'd expect because a distance the size of Crossbell State might be covered in 3 screens that take you 2 minutes to walk between, but cities when done right can seem completely massive. Heimdall is in-universe even bigger and more populated than Crossbell City, and while in the Crossbell arc you could visit every district in Crossbell, you never really get to do that in Heimdall. You can see down other streets, but as far as you're able to explore, you only get the tip of the iceberg, only visiting the few districts and small neighborhoods that are relevant. The Erebonia arc follows the young swordsman Rien Schwarzer, the adopted son of a baron, as he attends the prestigious Thors Military Academy. Thors is an old institution with a storied history, being initially founded by a legendary emperor who ended Erebonia's version of the War of the Roses, with the list of its most prominent students including many future emperors, the children of the 4 great houses of the nobility, Rien's adoptive father, and Gileath Osborne. Unfortunately, it's also a microcosm of the Empire's class conflict, as classes are separated between nobles and commoners, and the students are just teenagers, many of whom haven't formed their own worldviews yet, and are instead parroting their parents' prejudices, which are preventing progress and keeping the conflict alive. When Rien gets to the academy, he's immediately assigned to the brand new Class 7, a social experiment of sorts that brings together the best of commoners, nobles, and exchange students from Nord alike for the purpose of testing new orbital combat technology, and also, I guess, overcoming the barriers between different groups of people, and that's less important than making better weapons, you know. Military and all that. Many wacky school hijinks ensue, of course, as well as field studies, which are basically magic school bus field trips across Erebonia that never quite go as planned. The school class is of course drawn into a larger conspiracy as events unfold, and the social class tensions reach ahead, with Cold Steel 2 picking up where 1 left off, ending some plot threads and answering some questions, while leaving others tantalizingly open. Cold Steel 3 picks up a year and a half later as a now adult Rien has to contend with teaching his own Class 7 at Thor's new branch campus, his past, his actions during the last 2 games and over the time skip and how they've affected the world, all the while the threat to all Zemuria grows in the distance. Cold Steel 4, again taking place right after 3, in particular, reunites dozens of characters from Liberl, Crossbell, and Erebonia alike, as well as beyond, for an all-out confrontation against the greatest threat in the series so far. The Cold Steel games, especially 1 and 3, are structured very differently to even Liberl and Crossbell, and dare I say, have major Persona vibes. The battle technology Class 7 is testing is an upgraded version of a standard combat enhancement device that allows characters to link together to increase each other's battle power, and this was added both to the battle system and as an out-of-battle mechanic. While they existed in a more hidden sense in the Crossbell games, relationship values between Reen and the other members of Class 7, as well as several important NPCs, have been added, and you can increase them through the new bonding system, which is a slightly watered-down version of social links. Unfortunately, these games have the same problem as the Persona series with the fact that the bonding system has now locked important and sometimes vital to understand main story elements of characters' backstory and development behind optional, permanently missable conversations that you can only see all of through New Game Plus. The series also suffers from a little bit of cast bloat. While Class 7 isn't huge compared to parties from other games in the series, and you can definitely tell they're a tight-knit group who cares a lot about each other, there are a lot of members, and that only gets more exacerbated as new students join, and especially in Cold Steel 3 and 4 when Reen's new Class 7 is added onto the old class. Also, depending on the game, you'll have upperclassmen, teachers, faculty, bracer allies, members of the Erebonian military or nobility, and other characters who may also be important, join the party, or not join the party and still have bonding events and a relationship meter to increase, which will take away from your time bonding with Reen's classmates or students. There are absolutely times when this works very well. Reen might become separated from Class 7 and have to rely on the help of other friends to reunite. You might have to split a large party in multiple groups in order to tackle a giant dungeon at the same time. You could straight up have 2 different boss fights taking place at the same time on different sides of a location, or you could even swap parties between phases of one big fight. There's also a lot of really cool Chekhov's gun moments where a character knowing someone from a previous arc or being a student of Thor's or something like that comes back in a really cool way to help the protagonist out, or end up being evil all along in a real Darkest Hour sort of plot twist. Cold Steel 4, especially when it hits its highs, has a lot of really great moments that definitely serve as a proper send-off to the first half of Trails, and while I haven't yet played Reverie myself despite there being a fan translation out there, I'm assuming a lot of those continue there. On the other hand, you might have moments of an old character sort of stealing the spotlight from a more recent one, a more recent character going through a similar character growth moment that's made very obvious at where it came from because the original character who did that the first time is also there, and by the time you get to Cold Steel 4, there are members of the original Class 7 who haven't really had a spotlight in 2 games, or even a complete character arc to call their own. In more subjective terms, the writing can definitely be a bit more inconsistent in Cold Steel than it was in the past, and you might definitely not like the quirky high school setting, which permeates a lot of the series, although mostly 1 and 3. 2 and 4 take you further away from the school setting a lot more frequently, and involve a bit more involved things and more deeply going into Erebonian and world politics. If you felt restricted by the smaller size of Crossbell, then you will definitely like the exploration in Erebonia a lot more. While you do have a hub town in all of the Cold Steel games, unlike Crossbell City, which is the biggest and most involved part of Crossbell State, the 2 small suburbs that Thor's main and branch campuses are located in are not the most interesting places in the games, and your field studies will take you all across Erebonia to a bunch of different locales with a bunch of different interesting things to see and do. To make things even better, once you visited most of the important locales in one half of the Empire in an odd number Cold Steel game, the following even number one will, partway through the story, give you free reign and let you visit any area from that game or the previous one at any time, barring ones that either don't exist anymore or are closed off to you because of story reasons. This is vastly different from Crossbell, which had a small world which you were able to explore at any time throughout most of both games, and Liberl, which while it did have a relatively large overworld to explore, only sectioned you off into whatever certain area was relevant to the plot, not letting you pass forwards or backwards to different parts of the country, barring a small section of second chapter which ends with the point of no return, preventing you from exploring the overworld at all anyway. If you found the games too hard up until now, Cold Steel is widely regarded to be the easiest Trails arc, with my experience putting 3 and 4 on the highest difficulty about equivalent to a Sky game on normal. Obviously, if you prefer your games harder, you might not like this change, but the combat system is widely expanded with the previously mentioned links, and a bunch of other new mechanics that sometimes change on a game-to-game basis, giving you a lot more interesting tools to play with that, while you will be steamrolling enemies most of the time, will be really fun and really inventive, with a lot of really dumb broken strategies you could pull off. As far as visuals go, the Liberl and Crossbell arcs are obviously hilariously outdated because they're all using 2004 PSP technology, but I think they definitely have their own charm with the sprites and portraits even at higher resolutions. Cold Steel 1 and 2 are Vita games, so they're gonna look rough basically no matter what you do to them graphically, but 3 and 4, despite being PS4 games that come far from pushing the system to its limits, do still look pretty nice, and while they're not the best looking things, like any Falcom game really, I do still think they graphically hold up relatively well even in present day, and the cutscene animations have certainly improved a lot from the really rough moments of CS1 and 2. As far as timeline placement, Cold Steel 1 begins partway through Trails from Zero in March of Septim year 1204, ending in October. Cold Steel 2 picks up only a couple days later in November, and goes all the way through December, with a small flash-forward sequence in March of the following year. Cold Steel 3 takes a year-and-a-half time skip, starting in April of 1206 and ending that July, with Cold Steel 4 picking up only a couple days later from then, covering August and September. I'm not going to be going into Trails into Reverie in depth because it's not officially out in English and won't be for a long time, though it is currently playable using a fan translation and either a Japanese PS4 or Chinese PC copy, but for completeness sake I will explain the premise. Reverie is, as I've mentioned before, a second take at the concept of Sky the Third, but this time capping off both the Crossbell and Erebonia arcs as opposed to just Liberl. Reverie's main plot is actually split into 3 different storylines, each focusing around a different protagonist, 2 of whom were the frontmen of a previous Trails arc. The first focuses on Lloyd and the Special Support section as they continue to strive to keep Crossbell independent. The second focuses on Reen and his Class 7 as they continue their journey after the end of Cold Steel 4, and the third focuses on the mysterious new masked character known as C, which is an identity used by a character previously in earlier Cold Steel games, and their party of completely new characters as they investigate the Erebonian army. The game also has a massive side content dungeon known as the True Reverie Corridor, which brings together your parties from all 3 routes, allowing you to mix and match them together, and also lets you unlock other playable characters from across the Trails series, or a total of 50, as well as unlocking a bunch of little side scenes like the doors in Sky the Third, which is where you have a lot of your payoffs as small character moments, neat little fluff scenes, and massive foreshadowing to the future of the series. Said future is here today, at least if you speak Japanese, because Kuro no Kiseki is out, formally starting the second half of the series and the Calvard arc. This arc will take place in the Calvard Republic, the second major superpower that's been trying to take a bite out of Crossbell, and an eternal rival to Erebonia, even before the days when it became a republic at all. This game will take place even after Reverie in the year 1208, while Reverie only covers the first few months of 1207, and as such there's not really a lot we can glean about the general geopolitical state of Calvard, although we know it's been affected a lot by events in Cold Steel 4, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it. But it heavily reworked the combat system from the one that's been used from Cold Steel 3 through Reverie, including adding the option to switch to an action version on the dime to allow you to deal with minor enemies very quickly, reworked the bonding system heavily in response to fan complaints, and is supposed to be focusing on more morally grey characters with the addition of an alignment system. The main cast is going to be a party of 8 completely new characters of varying ages, backgrounds, and ethnicities, but a lot of returning characters have also been confirmed or hinted at, including playable roles for a much more mature-looking Class 7 member, a certain mentor of Estelle's, and a mysterious rival of Reen's who's hinted at in Reverie. Now you may have noticed that I completely passed over one of the 4 games that was just announced to be localized, and that's for good reason, because this last game, Nayuta no Kiseki, known in English now as The Legend of Nayuta, Boundless Trails, does not take place in Zemuria. We don't really know how it ties into the main series, but its protagonist has the same last name of a fan-favorite supporting character in Cold Steel, and everyone who's played Reverie seems to think that it ties in now, which is probably why they're localizing it before that comes out in English. Nayuta is also not a turn-based game like the rest of Trails, it's more of an action game in the line of Ys. It released in Japan on the PSP in 2012, getting a PS4 port that will presumably be the basis for the localized version earlier in 2021. The localized version will, just like Azure and Reverie, come out worldwide on PS4, Switch, and PC at some point in 2023. We don't know the exact order in which these localizations are going to come out, other than 0 comes first, but if I could guess based on the order in which they were revealed and the order it makes sense to me to release them, Azure is going to be the closest to 0 at some point earlier in 2023, then Nayuta at some point in the middle of the year, and Reverie at some point in late fall to early holiday season, which is around when they released the English version of Cold Steel 4. You're probably waiting for the most important part of the video, which is the play order, the best way to play each game, and my general tips and things to watch out for if you're a new player, but so far I've talked about structure and exploration, but not combat, so we're gonna do that first. I've mentioned a bunch of times now that Trails is turn-based, with the exception of Nayuta and Kuro in the future if you want to play it with that method. So if you don't like your turn-based combat systems, you're probably not going to like this series at all. I will say Trails has some of the best turn-based combat I've ever played, but if you don't like it, you're not going to like the series. Thankfully, there are no random encounters, barring the specific dungeon gimmick where you get ambushed if you screw up a certain mechanic, but that's par for the course. Every normal enemy will be a sprite or a model on the overworld, though your actual in-battle encounters will include more than just the enemy you see on the overworld. Early on in the Sky games, all you can really do is attempt to back attack enemies to get the jump on them, and if you get back attacked, you get a negative thing applied to you like Earthbound. But starting in Crossbell, you also gain the ability to attack on the overworld, potentially stunning enemies, making it easier to get the jump on them at the beginning of a fight. Turn order is a conditional turn-based method, sort of like Xenosaga or Final Fantasy X, where you don't always move in a set order, but the amount of turns a character will get in battle is determined by their speed. So of course speed is one of the most broken stats in the entire series. Each character has 3 different bars you'll have to manage. The first is HP, no real big deal there, while the second is EP, which is your magic points. Magic in this series takes the form of arts, different abilities granted to a character by whatever quartz they have slotted in their combat orbment. More on that in a minute. Orbments are very customizable, and while a character might have certain elemental affinities, any character can learn almost every art in a given game, so you can mix and match whichever arts you have on which people that properly benefit their stats and whatever stat bonuses they're getting from the quartz that give those arts. When a character selects an art, they'll go into a casting stance, dependent on whatever delay the art has. Generally more powerful ones have longer delays, and after that delay ends, the character will cast the art. This casting can be interrupted by certain enemy abilities, and when enemies try to use arts, some of your abilities can interrupt them, canceling their cast. The third bar is CP, or craft points, which is how you use your character's specific abilities known as crafts. Yes, your special abilities are called arts and crafts in the series, you just kinda get used to it. CP is accumulated by dealing damage, taking damage, or doing other certain actions in combat, and once you gain a certain amount of CP, you can spend that on a craft. Crafts work sort of in inverse to arts. When you use one, it'll come out automatically, but your next turn will be delayed by a certain period of time, dependent on the delay stat of that specific craft. Delay for both arts and crafts can be reduced by certain equipment or orbment setups. Every character has 5 equipment slots: 1 weapon, 1 armor, 1 shoes, and 2 accessories. Weapon, armor, and shoes rarely are more nuanced than just put the one with the best stats in, while accessories allow you to customize a little bit more. Early game, you're mostly going to get things that give you immunity to certain status ailments, while later on you'll get things that will give immunity to all ailments, 1 free revive if you die at the expense of that accessory breaking, or even more ridiculous things like massive stat boosts plus massive automatic CP gains that let you pull off some of the dumbest possible things you can do. The turn order might also have special perks, such as this attack doing a critical hit, regaining HP or SP, or certain other things, with a lot more options being added later on in future games that can swing battles wildly in your favor. You can manipulate the turn order by using abilities with certain delays at certain times, like casting an art that will make that character with low health come back up on the turn order when there's an HP recovery thing, or by using the S-break system. Unlike arts, crafts are completely unique to each character, although games with larger casts tend to give multiple characters with similar abilities. Each playable character, with very few exceptions, also has an S-craft, an extremely powerful move that for the most part is just a really strong hit either on a single enemy or AoE, but in some cases are shields or heals, better than most arts available. These S-crafts have a CP cost of 100, though your CP meter can go up to 200. An S-craft used at 100 CP is already very good, but if you let it fill all the way to 200, it becomes even more potent. S-crafts also allow you to manipulate the turn order even better with a process known as S-breaking. Once a character hits 100 CP, you can insert a certain button combination which will allow them to S-break, which means they'll hijack the turn order and perform their S-craft immediately, regardless of when their next turn is going to be. You can use this to take extreme advantage of certain turn effects, such as having your 200 CP character swoop in and deal a massive blow to the enemy after you've buffed them up a bit and S-braked on a guaranteed critical hit turn. Battles take place on a grid, and area of effect is important. Certain abilities have line or circle effects, and there are some cones I believe as well, and some area of effects are either centered on your target or centered on a location you determine, so an enemy can actually move out of your AoE and not get hit by it. If you make one of your characters cast a line art that's targeting 3 enemies, but all of those enemies get to move before the art will come out, you're probably not going to be doing a lot of damage that turn. While gear is important, the most important part of your character's build is definitely your orbment, which is in my opinion the most interesting part of Trails combat. It's sort of like combining materia from Final Fantasy with the gems from Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and X, except those also are what give you access to your magic spells. Orbment is the in-universe term for any machine that operates using Orbal Magitech, but as far as we're concerned right now, we're talking about the tactical orbments, which are pocket watch-sized devices that let you insert things called quartz that amplify a user's physical abilities, as well as giving them access to arts. Depending on whatever model orbment the characters in the game you're playing use, you'll have anywhere between 6 and 8 slots for quartz. Each character's slots are connected in a unique way, and most characters will have certain slots that are restricted to one of the 7 quartz elements, the usual wind, water, earth, fire, as well as the 3 higher elements of space, time, and mirage. Most of your arts also belong to one of those elements, and elemental weaknesses and resistance are definitely an important part of combat. The more slots you open, the higher a character's AP will get, and later games in an arc usually tend to replace opening new slots with upgrading slots, allowing you to insert higher level quartz. In the Liberl and Crossbell arcs, each quartz has a specific buff it gives you, be it a stat increase at the expense of another stat, the ability to interrupt an enemy's art cast with 20% of your normal attacks, or some other utility-based things, and also has a certain elemental value. Each quartz is specifically only one element, but many higher level ones also have smaller values for different elements. Each art is tied to a certain value of a mix of elements, and you can get a character to learn that art if you have that amount of points in a single line of that character's orbment. As such, characters with longer lines tend to be the better casters, and they also get more EP, as a slot further down in a line has a higher EP gain compared to one closer to the center of the orbment. Azure also introduces the Master Quartz system, which is a special quartz that goes in the center slot of your orbment and levels up as you fight with it. Master Quartz confers stat buffs, some minor utility abilities, and the ability to outright cast a few arts. If you remove a quartz that's allowing you to use an art from your orbment, you will lose that art, so you will have to reshuffle your orbment a lot depending on the arts you want to use. Cold Steel retains the Master Quartz feature from Azure, but changes up how regular quartz work completely. Gone are the elemental points, and instead, certain quartz will just outright give you the ability to cast one or more arts, while others give you stat boosts or different utility abilities. More powerful quartz tend to combine arts with stat boosts, so the further you get in the game, the more stuff you'll get on one character. Cold Steel also removes the grid system, and as such makes combat a bit more free-flowing, but it ultimately just makes your abilities a bit harder to aim. I've only really fully described the combat in just Sky First Chapter, as soon as Second Chapter they introduce new mechanics like combo crafts, and later games in the series expand a lot more, with Azure's Burst ability, and Cold Steel allowing you to link 2 party members together. Cold Steel 3, 4, and Reverie also include the Break Meter from Xenosaga 3, my favorite turn-based battle system of all time, as well as the Brave Order system, which is a special way of granting party-wide buffs for a certain amount of turns, which break the game even more. So, that was a not-so-abridged intro to Trails as a whole, but let's say I convince you to give the series a try. How are you supposed to play all these games? Simply put, PC is the best way to experience the entire series. Not just because you can get them in the highest quality if you have the best computer, but also because it's the only platform on which all the games will be available. In particular, the Sky Trilogy and the first 2 Cold Steel games are going to be the hardest ones to get on console going forward, because Xseed has no incentive to keep publishing them since they don't have the publishing rights to any future Trails games. Unfortunately, This means the two best entry points to the series are going to be locked on probably whatever platforms they're on now. Sky is especially bad because it's only on PSP and PC, and the PSP version of First Chapter has a worse translation. With Cold Steel, the Vita and PS3 versions are also available, as is the PS4 and PC ones, but I would recommend using one of the latter two platforms because PS3 and Vita don't have Turbo, and Turbo in a Trails game cuts 20 hours off of your playtime and makes it a lot faster of an experience. The other 5 games in the series are going to be available pretty much anywhere you look as long as you don't have exclusively a Mac or an Xbox. You might be a little worried about the Switch versions of Cold Steel 3, 4, and Reverie, as those were PS4 games to begin with, but although I haven't played them myself, reports are that the Switch ports are playable. There are frame drops and they obviously don't look as good as the PlayStation or PC versions, but they do work fine and look pretty good as far as Switch games go. The big weirdness comes with the case of Crossbell. Zero, Azure, and Nayuta were released in between Sky the Third and Cold Steel 1, but have not been officially localized yet and won't be completely until 2023. At least Reverie comes after Cold Steel 4, and Cold Steel 4 is already out, as are the previous Cold Steel games. There is no real playable fan translation of Nayuta, so you're probably best with waiting for that anyway, but Crossbell is a different beast. There are multiple fan translations of the Crossbell games, the best of which is done by a group known as the Geofront, and is designed to work off of legitimately purchased Asian PC versions, Japanese for Zero, and Chinese for Azure, both of which are purchasable right now from basically anywhere in the world because you can get them with PayPal. The only issue with using those is Geofront partnered with NIS America for the official localizations of the Crossbell games, so they took down their fan translations because they're being used as the basis for the official localizations, which won't be coming for another 2 years. However, this is the internet, so if you do some digging, you can still find the patches that will apply the Geofront localizations to the existing PC Crossbell games, and you can play those easily in English without waiting for the official localizations if you so want to. Just keep in mind, while the Geofront translation is fantastic and on par with any of the official Trails localizations, which is why it's being used as the basis for official Trails localizations, and they added a bunch of neat quality of life features, these PC versions are based on the PC versions and not the Japanese PS4 versions, so you will be missing out on a few additional features like the Cold Steel cameos. Hajimari no Kiseki is also playable in English right now, but it does not have a full fan translation patch, and you will have to use some sort of third-party resource rather than directly modifying your game. The two main options you have are using a spreadsheet, which just lists what the line in Japanese or Chinese is and tells you what it is in English, or using an overlay program. This one might be a little bit less accessible depending on what hardware you have because it requires either a PS4 and PS4 Remote Play or a capture card, or a PC capable of running the PC version of the game. What it does is it will take any feed of the game that you have on your actual PC screen and overlay a translation of story text on top of it, reading your controller inputs in order to determine when to advance the text. The issues with this are, of course, you have to play through the game in the exact order that the person who made the overlay translation did, or things will get out of sync, and it of course misses a lot of NPC dialogue, and the fact that the menus are still not translated, so you will still have to rely on the spreadsheet for that, but I have heard a lot of good reviews for it, and I will probably be using it to play through the game relatively soon after I make this video. I can wait a few years for the official Kuro release, but there are a lot of open ends in Cold Steel 4, and I really want to know what those are about. I believe a lot of the people who worked on the Hajimari overlay have already announced a Kuro fan translation project that's going to include spreadsheet and overlay as well, so it's possible that projects like this by fans are going to be the optimal way to play new Trails games, because the localizers are doing a massive amount of catch-up on Trails games that had never been localized before, and there was already a big localization gap just in the later Cold Steel games, so you might just straight up have lost interest in Trails by the time the official Kuro localization comes out, while you could have played it with a fan translation like a year and a half earlier, and have gotten a less than perfect but still very good experience, because let's face it, Kuro 2 and possibly Kuro 3 will be out by the time the Kuro 1 official localization is. Unfortunately, you do need a PC to play through the entire series, but you don't need that good of one, in order to get to the point where you can play the rest on either Switch or PlayStation. If you have a PS4 or PS5, the only games you actually need PC for are the Sky Trilogy, and if you only have a Switch, you only need Sky and Cold Steel 1 and 2. Thankfully, despite having released first on PC way back in 2004, the Sky Trilogy is still a bunch of PSP games at heart, so you can play them on basically anything. If I remember correctly, the system requirements for the Sky games are less intensive than the ones for Windows 10, let alone 11, so if you currently, on your PC, can run an up-to-date version of the software for your game store of choice, you can already run the Sky games. I believe they're on Steam, Epic Games Store, and GOG, so power is not an issue whatsoever. Cold Steel 1 and 2 are obviously a little bit harder, but they are still Vita games, so, any current PC is still going to run them fine. I do have some anecdotal evidence that integrated graphics isn't enough to cut it, but if you have a decent desktop or a pretty good laptop from the past few years, you should be able to run them no problem. The Geofront versions of the Crossbell games are also PSP games at heart, so they'll run no problem on basically anything, but I would be slightly wary about playing the official Crossbell versions on PC if you can't run Cold Steel 1 and 2 very well, just because those were based on PS4 games, so while they are obviously PSP games, to some degree, I don't know what was changed in the underlying architecture, so they might be a bit harder to run on a weaker PC. TLDR, Sky and Crossbell will run on one potato, Cold Steel 1 and 2 will run on two potatoes, and you might actually need a somewhat decent PC to play anything from Cold Steel 3 onwards. It's also worth mentioning that in the past, the games would come to whatever platform Falcom initially released them on first, with PC and other versions coming roughly 6 months later. As in, Cold Steel 3 released first on PS4, then Switch and PC versions came out, same thing with Cold Steel 4, and Ys 9, a PS4 Falcom game that came out after CS4, did the exact same thing. Obviously, the 4 recently announced localizations are different, they're coming out on all of their platforms at once, but that might just be a side effect of NIS America doing this big catch-up to Trails localization push, so you might need a PlayStation to play future Trails games when they first come out in English, starting with Kuro. The TLDR for all of that is the definitive version of Sky is PC, Cold Steel 1 and 2 is PS4 or PC, currently Crossbell is PC, but in the future once the rest of the localizations are out, Crossbell, Reverie, Nayuta, Cold Steel 3, and 4 are all whichever platform you choose unless you only own an Xbox, in which case, oh well. I'm going to go over voice language here because that might affect which version of a game you might want to play. When they first came out, the Sky and Crossbell games had very minimal voice acting. Sky only had battle dialogue, and Crossbell only had battle dialogue and small voice snippets of very key story scenes. The battle dialogue in the Sky games did actually get an English dub, surprisingly enough, and when those characters show up in later Cold Steel games, over half of them have the same voice actor as they did a decade ago, which is really genuinely cool, and one of the few that changed is a 12-year-old who's now 17 in Cold Steel, so it actually makes a ton of sense. All 5 of those games do have a full Japanese dub though, even including side quests, but those came from PlayStation re-releases that came out after the original versions the current translations are based on. You can, however, fairly easily mod an English release of one of the Sky games and the Geofront versions of Crossbell to include those Japanese voice lines, so you can already play all 5 of those games with the full Japanese voice acting. It is worth noting, though, that, once again, official Crossbell releases will be based on the PS4 versions, which already have the full Japanese dub baked into them, so you won't need to mod anything if you want those. All the Cold Steel games have English dubs, and it looks like both Nayuta and Reverie are getting them as well. I'm actually kind of surprised Nayuta is getting one, but I'm assuming it has way less dialogue than a normal Trails game, so they could do it a lot easier than dubbing all of Crossbell. The English dubs for the Cold Steel games are very good. They use a lot of voice actors I like, and a lot of people I hadn't heard of until I heard them in those games, and I'd actually go as far as to say that the English versions of Cold Steel 1 and 2 are the definitive versions of the game. This is no slight against the Japanese voice cast at all, they're also great. The Prince of Erebonia is voiced by Dio's voice actor in Japanese, and Matt Mercer as Sean Gilmore in English, as in, he's Dio in Japanese and Jotaro in English, which is just kind of amazing, and I can't really top that in any way. But the point is, the dubs of Cold Steel 1 and 2 actually contain more voiced lines than the Japanese versions, just because Xseed paid for the voice cast to voice more scenes because they felt that it added to the story. Also, some of this stems from the fact that Reen's Japanese voice actor is expensive, so there are a bunch of scenes where he's not voiced, but the people he's talking to are, which get really uncanny, and those unfortunately do come back in Cold Steel 3 and 4. Also, unfortunately, because of the publisher change, the long period of time between Cold Steel 2 and 3 causing some people to be busy, and COVID, a few voice actors did have to be shuffled around between 2 and 3, and again between 3 and 4. This isn't a super big deal, and a lot of returning characters get new voices that fit them very well, but you do unfortunately lose Ashley Birch as one of the Class 7 members in a game where she has a lot more importance than she did in the past, and very unfortunately, one of the major villains of Cold Steel has to get a voice actor change in between 3 and 4, which is a real bummer because I really like the previous dub voice actor. Also, because of COVID, you're going to hear a bit of inconsistency in the dub recordings for Cold Steel 4 because a lot of them are recording from home, and Estelle especially sounds really bad for some reason, even though it's the same voice actress as before. Acting's still great, and she absolutely sounds like an older version of the same character, but the audio quality itself isn't very good, and those lines have not been re-recorded as of now. So, with all of that out of the way, what order do I think you should play the Trails series in? This is going to assume you have at least one platform that can play every game, and you're planning on playing through the entire series. Objectively speaking, the best way to play through the series is the original Japanese release order with Nayuta in wherever you feel like it, because that is what the developers intended. However, for anyone outside of Japan, that's not exactly the most feasible thing to do, especially if you only want to stick to official releases. Cold Steel 1 is also a viable starting point for the series in addition to Sky First Chapter, as it's a bit of a soft reboot that changes up the gameplay a little bit, and spoils very little about what actually happened in Liberl and Crossbell, so as long as you don't read the in-universe newspapers you have access to, you'll barely be spoiled on the first two arcs through the end of Cold Steel 2. CS3 is where the characters from previous arcs and references to things that happened really start coming in, and that's the point in the series where you should definitely play every single game up until then, with the possible exception of Nayuta if you want to save that before Reverie. Do not listen to the fact that Falcom's president and NIS America have touted Cold Steel 3 as a good place to start the series. It is not. They were really only saying that in an attempt to drum up Cold Steel 3 sales, as NIS America was the new publisher for the series, and as such wouldn't be getting any money from sales of the Sky or previous Cold Steel games. With all that being said, in 2021, the only real excuse you have for not starting with Sky First Chapter and going with Cold Steel instead is if you just outright don't own a PC, are planning on playing the entire series via PS4 or 5, and are going to get your Sky experience through watching a synopsis or a Let's Play. People have said in the past that Cold Steel 1 might be a better starting point for new players, because it's newer, it's fresher, and it looks nicer. But let's be real, it's a Vita game, Sky First Chapter is a PSP game, they're one generation apart, and both of those systems are extremely outdated now, so Cold Steel is really barely a newer game than Sky. And also, sprites are timeless, so the Sky games have visually aged way better than CS1 and 2 have in the first place. Cold Steel 1 might have better quality of life features than Sky First Chapter, but in my opinion, from someone who only played the series for the first time in 2020, the Sky games, at least the PC version, still hold up really well from a QOL standpoint. There's a bunch of autosaves that are extremely generous, you can retry fights if you lose, including being able to lower the difficulty for your next attempt, and a bunch of cool stuff like that, plus turbo button good. And honestly, in my opinion, Cold Steel 1 and 2 is just a weaker package than Sky, even if you only include first and second chapter. You personally might just want to get the fan-considered weakest two games in the series out of the way right off the bat, and if you want to do that and start with Cold Steel, then I understand, but personally, I think a series should at least start on a relative high point to hook you, and in my opinion, Sky is just a better game than Cold Steel 1, so I think you should start there. The first game in every Trails arc is pretty slow even by JRPG standards just because it's always a lot of setup, but depending on how voice acting affects your play experience, either First Chapter or Cold Steel 1 might seem faster or slower than the other because one has voice acting and one doesn't, so if voice acting makes something feel faster and more engaging to you, you might want to mod in the Japanese voices into a PC version of Sky FC if you want that to hook you on the series. If you don't own a PC, if you want to get the worst out of the way, or if you really like Persona and you don't think you're going to get hooked on another series unless it has Persona elements, then you can go ahead and start with Cold Steel 1 and play 2 right after that before looping back to Sky. In any other circumstance, just start with Sky First Chapter and play through all three Sky games. So, here are the play orders I would recommend. I'm not really going to include Nayuta in any of these play orders just because it's not part of the main Zemiria timeline, but it is still important to play at some point. All of my orders are going to have Reverie at the end, because that's the current most recent game in the series, even in Japan, because obviously I'm recording this before Kuro launch day. So I'm just going to always slot Nayuta in before Reverie, and the play orders are mostly going to be focused on Sky First Chapter through Cold Steel 4. Obviously, the quote-unquote one true play order is going to be entire Liberl Arc, entire Crossbell Arc, entire Erebonia Arc, Nayuta, Reverie. But you're probably not going to want to do that if you're sticking to official localizations. Currently, in 2021, the way to play through this is PC Liberl Arc, Geofront PC Crossbell Arc, PC or PS4 Erebonia Arc, either wait for Nayuta to come out or skip it until it releases officially, and then spreadsheet/overlay fan translation or wait for the official to come out for Reverie. If you're watching this video at any point after the official release of Trails to Azure, please play through the series in this order. I know the Crossbell games do spoil a bit of Cold Steel, but this is the official developer-intended play order. If you're watching this soon after Azure's release and are capable of getting through the 3 Sky games, the 2 newly localized Crossbell games, and the 4 Cold Steel games prior to Reverie's release, you will be one of the very first Western Trails fans to play through the entire series in English, officially, in the developer-intended order, and I am incredibly jealous of you. Please get your Trails experience the way it was intended and play through the games in release order, just putting in Nayuta whenever you feel like it. If you're watching this at any point in time pre-official Azure release, you're gonna have to get a little bit experimental because all the localizations aren't out yet. You're obviously going to want to save Reverie for last anyway because it's the setup for everything that comes after what's come before it. I know that was a little confusing, just don't think about that too hard. But things are going to get a little weird if you don't want to use fan translations. If you do, just find the Geofront Crossbell games, play them, and potentially use the Reverie overlay if you want to do that. I actually have 2 play orders for this scenario, but I would honestly recommend one over the other because I think it better pieces out the rate at which you play through the games, giving you a couple months for each one, as opposed to stuffing most of the Erebonia arc into a period of only a few weeks to a couple months, which is something even I was only able to do when I had basically nothing else going on. The first is the not so well paced one, and that is to still play everything in release order, but you spread things out a bit. Play through the Sky trilogy either slowly or all at once and take a break, then wait for the official localizations of Crossbell to come out, and once you're done with the official version of Azure, quickly binge all 4 Cold Steel games and then probably Nayuta at that point, before the official Reverie comes out. I wouldn't recommend this, because you're basically playing 3 games slowly, then 5 games quickly in order to be caught up in time for Reverie. If you're willing to use the currently existent Geofront versions of the games that do definitely exist out there, you can drip feed yourself a bit and play through one Trails game every couple months or so, but the cliffhangers at the ends of certain games are going to be really brutal if you do it that way, so I kinda don't recommend that. The other play order is my personal recommendation for how you should play through the series until the Crossbell localizations come out. If you're starting anytime in between the release of this video and the official release of Trails to Azure, this is how I think you should play through the series. All 3 games in the Sky trilogy. Cold Steel 1, Cold Steel 2, wait for the official Crossbell localizations, play those as they come out, Cold Steel 3, Cold Steel 4, Nayuta, Reverie. I just think this is the best way to do it because it paces you out the best way while also minimizing spoilers. If you want to play Cold Steel 3 and 4, go ahead, but you're going to make everything that happens in the Crossbell arc a foregone conclusion. As I said before, I would recommend not reading the in-universe newspapers in Cold Steel 1 and 2, the only time I'd ever recommend not doing that in the series just because they have a bit more in-depth spoilers for Crossbell than just the actual plots of Cold Steel 1 and 2, but other than that, your spoilers will be kept to a minimum, so it really is the most beginner-friendly way to play through the series prior to the official Crossbell localizations. This play order will also minimize cliffhangers. You're not left on the end of a cliffhanger for any of the Cold Steel characters because CS2 is basically the end of a mini arc, the first half of the Cold Steel saga, so you leave Cold Steel at a natural conclusion point, able to pick it up later in the future, especially because the climax of Azure is exactly 1 day before the climax of Cold Steel 2, so basically when you play Crossbell, you're catching up to where the games you've already played have ended. So to recap one more time, If you're watching this after the official release of Trails to Azure, you should play Trails in the Sky First Chapter, Sky Second Chapter, Sky the Third, Trails from Zero, Trails to Azure, Cold Steel 1, Cold Steel 2, Cold Steel 3, Cold Steel 4, The Legend of Nayuta, Trails into Reverie. If you're watching this before Azure's official release, then you should play Sky First Chapter, Sky Second Chapter, Sky the Third, Cold Steel 1, Cold Steel 2, wait until the official release of Zero, then the official release of Azure, then Cold Steel 3, Cold Steel 4, Nayuta, and Reverie. And so with all of that out of the way, it's time for a general miscellaneous stuff section. Here's just a bunch of tips, other things I haven't mentioned, and things to watch out for when you start Trails. Some of it might make you want to play the games more, some of it might be neutral but just help you out with your experience, and some of it might be reasons you might personally not like the series. First off, the music in the series is quite good overall. You've been hearing exclusively Falcom music for the entirety of this video, the majority being from various Trails games, with only a couple tracks coming from Ys. So I probably don't need to tell you that you're gonna want headphones for these. Unlike a lot of JRPGs, you're not going to become obscenely rich just by playing through the game. You do have to grind if you want excessive amounts of money. This won't get you completely overpowered level-wise, its experience scales very well to keep you from out-leveling the actual areas you're going through, but don't be surprised if you're bankrupting yourself just to fully equip everyone every time you arrive at a new town. This is in part due to the fact that you do not get straight-up money for winning fights against enemies. You get special resources that can either be sold or used to upgrade your orbments and forge new quartz, so especially early on in each game, you're not going to be getting a whole lot of money just by fighting enemies without grinding. I'd obviously recommend cashing everything in and making mad cash as soon as you reach the endgame, because your quartz are probably completely built by then, but before then, it's okay to not be able to fully equip everyone once you reach a new gear tier. In fact, it's pretty encouraged most of the time, because you're very frequently going to have way more party members available than you can fit in one fight, so if you need to swap people around, you can also just swap their gear around, since in the vast majority of cases, weapons are the only things that are locked to an individual character. The Cold Steel games do add another resource that drops from enemies and can only be used for selling, also fetching a better price than the quartz fodder material, but at the same time, you also gain the ability to swap in reserve members mid-fight, so you're going to want to have a larger percentage of your characters fully geared and ready to battle. If you do want straight cash, the best way to get it is just by progressing the story or doing side quests, because that's really the only time you just straight up get paid in money. You might not like it and probably won't need it for actual combat, but if you want to avoid permanently missable stuff and get the highest rank on everything, you are going to want to use a guide. A lot of side quests are hard to find, and many of them aren't posted on notice boards or other formal ways of giving you quest information, and there's an in-universe book you can get in every single game that you obtain in chapters throughout the story by talking to specific NPCs at specific times, and a lot of them are really obtuse, so a lot of times you'll reach the endgame, realize you're missing a couple chapters, and not be able to get the entire story. Just like everything else in Trails, these in-universe books are very important, and many of them are tales of real historical things that happened, or foreshadowing for future games and characters, so you are going to want them. If you miss one, you can just read them on the wiki, but if you want to get them naturally through playing the game, and you can also turn in a complete book in the endgame of most games for other rewards, you do definitely need a guide your first way through. Additionally, each game has a ranking system that gets you rewards including items, and you can often transfer over your rank progress into a future game in the same arc for goodies when you start the next game, and even a level carryover. A lot of the rank points are based on making dialogue decisions or doing specific things in a specific order, which you're probably not going to know off the top of your head first time, so you might want a guide for that to avoid save scumming those. Food can be extremely useful if you're struggling in combat, so make sure to find recipes and have a decent amount of ingredients on hand all the time. You never know what can come in handy. Fishing kind of sucks in basically every single game it's in, especially a certain mini-game in Sky the Third, so don't necessarily go for it unless you do want 100% the game and do all the side content. It does have rewards, but nothing super necessary for breaking the game or anything. Cold Steel 1 and 2 are the worst because it's some really painful mashing, and it does get way better in 3 and 4, but it never really gets better than a kind of lackluster side activity. If you're playing a game on any platform that has achievements, there is going to be one for getting every single treasure chest in that game, and there are a lot of permanently missable ones due to certain areas getting closed off for you. This is another reason to have a guide just for the purpose of making sure you didn't miss anything, because I would have Platinum Cold Steel 4 my first playthrough were it not for a single treasure chest in a one-time visit dungeon 20 hours before the end of the game. I've said it before, but I really would recommend talking to NPCs, at least the named ones. Every single one is a character who goes through their own story throughout the game and reacts to different things in different ways, and a lot of them will even turn up as crossovers later on in the series, be it in the same or a later arc, and it's kind of amazing. If you're uncomfortable with the game pushing a relationship between adoptive siblings, then you might want to avoid the Sky series, because the early games do heavily focus on whether or not Joshua and Estelle are going to get together. I will say that they put in basically every single stipulation you possibly could to make it as not weird as possible, as in they meet when they are already preteens and basically know that they're not blood related the entire time. Everyone in universe basically treats it as if they're childhood friends who are growing up and finally realizing how they really feel about each other, and it's explicitly stated multiple times that feelings between them existed before they even thought of each other as family. So that is a thing, but even if you're okay with that, Cold Steel does a very similar thing, but like worse in every single conceivable way, so if that bothers you, you might want to just skip the entire series. As far as other stuff goes, the series doesn't really get a lot heavier than you would expect from a T-rated JRPG, so it's a lot of lighthearted anime stuff, but I would like to give a massive content warning for Star Door 15, the last of the optional vignettes in Trails in the Sky III. I don't want to outright say exactly what it includes, because that is unfortunately technically a spoiler for stuff that happens there, but if you're at all concerned about that, I would highly recommend looking up exactly what it includes before seeing it for yourself, or having a friend go through it for you, or look it up on a video, just because it is by far the heaviest thing I've seen in the series up through Cold Steel 4, and it could very easily catch someone off guard who was not prepared for that kind of thing in their lighthearted anime game. On a lighter note, the series can be funny, but a lot of the funniest parts of it are either references to previous things in funny ways, which rewards you for playing more of the games, or are just some weird meta things, like characters who had the similar role in two different parties meeting up and being like, hey, you're similar, or Lloyd roasting Reen for kind of being a harem protagonist when he is also very much one, so there's a lot of that. Your mileage may vary on whether or not you find stuff like that funny, but there are some legitimately comedy-based side quests and character interactions that did legitimately get me to laugh a couple times. Nobody likes Blue Blanc. It is very much okay to also not like Blue Blanc. The series contains an anime evil organization which numbers its high-ranking members in certain ways. Once you get introduced to that, I would highly recommend making your own little spreadsheet noting down which numbers you've gotten to and met so far, because you might be able to suss out certain things that'll happen in the future because of it. That legitimately happened for me. I still have the piece of paper. It's got spoilers, so I'm not going to show it to you. Spend all your bonding points on Toa in every single Cold Steel game. It's worth it. In Cold Steel 2, make sure to go to Millium's bonding event on December 22nd. Whichever other ones you go to doesn't matter, but Millium sets up something in the ending that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if you don't see that scene. Don't let the poster with Estelle, Lloyd, and Reen, or all those different group shots, some of which even include Kevin, fool you. Olivier is the real main character of the series. At one point in the Geofront version of Trails from Zero, Randy is going to reference a certain meme that was contemporary at the time the localization was made. Do not mention this at all on the internet because you will start a massive comment war about the nature of localizations and what makes a good one. There are several forced loss fights throughout the series. This is not unusual at all for JRPGs, but the tricky part is you can actually win some of these, and doing so will give you additional rank points, as well as slightly different dialogue after the fight ends, which is usually just the classic, "This wasn't even my full power." The worst one of these is in Azure, because you are given a time limit in real time in which you need to win the fight. You get less rewards for just surviving or only reducing the enemy's HP a certain percentage, but the maximum, which might be required for highest rank, I don't think it is, but it's still useful to get, does require you to completely deplete their HP. Skip animations for this, that's the easiest way to win, and you might want to go in with a specific build for that. And I would always recommend save early, save often, so you can properly spec your team out for a specific fight if you realize it's a forced loss that you'd like to win, and you're having trouble the first couple times. Thankfully, they did learn from this mistake and any future time-limited fight is based on the amount of turns that have passed, and eventually by Cold Steel 4, they just straight up give you a turn counter on screen and tell you almost exactly what the requirements for getting additional rank points are for each fight. The Art Earthwall is extremely overpowered in the Sky games, and Kevin's S-Craft is also one of the best abilities you have at your disposal. In general, Arts start out the best thing in the Sky games, and as the series goes on, it gradually transitions to Crafts being the best, with you barely needing to use Arts at all by the end of Cold Steel. Speaking of Cold Steel, that series actually has a secondary battle system that only shows up a couple times in the first game, but becomes used a lot more frequently for bosses in the second and beyond. It's significantly more stripped down and relies on a bit more rock, paper, scissors than the main battle system of the series, so you might want to use a guide just to know how to properly exploit enemies' weaknesses, just so you're not floundering around and having to reset once you figure out the right thing to do. Estelle is fairly mediocre as far as characters in the Sky trilogy go. You don't need to invest everything into her, and you might want to just make her a heal bot if you're having a lot of trouble. In the Sky games, anything and everything that heals you recovers a set amount of HP each time, but in Crossbell and later, healing arts and crafts scale based on the user's stats, while items obviously stay the same, so make sure you notice this change when you swap arcs, so you're not accidentally healing wrong and either wasting EP or CP, overhealing your characters, or not healing them enough and being confused when you die. A lot of bosses have gimmicks based on inflicting a certain status ailment, so if you're having trouble with them, just quit out, load up an earlier save, and stock up on accessories that null that specific ailment. Those are always some of the cheapest and earliest to obtain accessories in every single game, so you can just buy a full set and then sell them back to make money to buy another set for whatever the next boss is if you're really struggling, but if not, you only really need to make sure your healer doesn't get afflicted so they can recover everyone else. Anything that gives you passive CP regen is fantastic. You get multiple gladiator items that do that in every single game, and there's no reason to not spread them around your party or even stack two on the same character so they can just spam their S-Craft constantly. Cold Steel 2 has a side quest exclusive to New Game Plus that lasts for the entirety of the playthrough. This will give you a bunch of in-game books that have a lot of lore in them, and caps off with an important scene that reveals a lot more lore and expands upon a few characters who you don't really get to see a lot. Unfortunately, Reen learns things as well as the player in this scene, and Cold Steel 3 treats the knowledge Reen gained in that scene as common knowledge and doesn't explain anything about it whatsoever, assuming you, the player, have seen that scene before. I would highly recommend not playing through the game an entire second time just to see that scene, and look up a video by YouTuber, Trials Enthusiast, and Geofront member KillSkyKill, because that basically just explains everything. If you do end up becoming a longtime fan of the series and intend on following it in the future, you definitely need to know that Falcom absolutely treats Western fans as second-class citizens compared to Japanese ones. They cater almost exclusively to Japan in terms of merchandise and stuff, and do not care whatsoever about making Western fans wait a long time for new games, or spoiling them on their content outright. The 4 new Trails localizations were all announced at a 40th anniversary livestream for Falcom that involved a bit of a concert and stuff. There was a piece of promotional artwork for Falcom's 40th anniversary. This art came out at the actual 40th of the company, which was a few months before the livestream and a few months after Trails into Reverie released as Hajimari no Kiseki in Japan and Asia. This art shows C, the masked character whose identity is a massive spoiler, unmasked. This was used in the Western version of the concert, the one where they first revealed that Reverie would be getting localized in the first place, and they went ahead and spoiled one of the major twists. Falcom does not care at all about Western fans getting the full experience. This unfortunately extends to localization time too. We now live in a world where niche JRPGs like the Xenoblade series and Shin Megami Tensei are getting worldwide releases, but Falcom fans still have to wait 2.5 to 3 years for an official localization of most of their new games. If what I know is correct, this is in part because NIS does not get the game to begin their localization work until after it releases in Japan, because apparently the fact that Falcom's sometimes changing the script up until release means that the localizers can't work on a living copy of the script that's actively being changed both in Japanese and in English. I don't get it at all, it's terrible, and you should unfortunately not expect this to change at any point in the near future. Very frequently, Falcom's decisions are what happens when you take Shigeru Miyamoto's backwards view on how video games work, acting like it's still last millennium, and apply it to an entire company. At least when Miyamoto screws something up, it's only one branch of Nintendo and the rest is still usually making good games, but in this case it affects Falcom's entire output, which at this point is just Ys and Trails because they don't feel like catering towards their older fans and only focusing on their more lucrative series. It sucks, but thankfully, fans are the lifeblood of the Western Falcom fandom, and I would almost expect fan translations to be the optimal way to play future Trails games, just because the massive wait for Reverie is going to make the wait for Kuro even longer, and by the time the official Kuro localization comes out, Falcom will probably have released at least 2 more games, and will never really be reasonably caught up to the Japanese release of the series. So, while this new localization boom is going to be great for people starting in the next couple years, after everyone catches up to Reverie, we're basically going to all end up in the same pot of waiting for whenever the next fan translation is going to be, because Reverie late 2023 means Kuro is probably going to be 2025, at which point Kuro 2, Ys 10, and Kuro 3 are all going to be out, and Falcom will be posting massive spoilers for Kuro 1 everywhere, while the localizers hoping to ever catch up with the Japanese output is going to be a lost hope. Most Falcom fans are good at supporting the official releases when they do come out, and you should obviously do that too if you become a fan of the series. Just keep in mind that for every game after Reverie, a fan translation is probably going to be the first way you're going to play it. I want to end this video by giving a generic, the last tip I have for you is to have fun, but I don't have a clever way of saying that, so I'm just going to transition to the end of the video by saying, if you've gotten through this much and haven't been convinced to play Trails, it's probably not going to be your series, and that's okay. Find another game to play. If you haven't played Xeno yet, you might want to do that, and if you don't like JRPGs, why have you even gotten this far? But I hope I have convinced you to try the series out, because it is good. And if you have made it this far, thank you for watching. I have a strange feeling that I've been able to convince plenty of people to try it long before this point in the video, so I'd be very surprised if there's a significant amount of people who are even hearing these words. But yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if I'm actually going to make regular Trails content. Once I'm able to stream again, that's probably going to be a series that I'm going to do a lot. But yeah, I'm actually going to thank my patrons in this specific video, even though it's not a scripted Xeno video, which is usually the only ones I have shoutouts for them for. And that's just because I've been barely making content, and I think they should be shouted out for still supporting me despite that. So thank you all very much, and if you aren't subscribed to me, and you like Xeno, you should subscribe to me. I don't really have anything interesting to say there, because I don't know how many people who aren't subscribed to me and are Xeno fans, but not Trails fans, made it this far. So yeah. I haven't made a video in a long time, so not very good at doing outros. But until next time, this is in fact Luxin, signing off.